Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Draper, and I'm an assistant professor of music composition and theory at the Suttner School of Music at Syracuse University. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Ann Laver, assistant professor and university organist at SU, and we both like to welcome you to the next installment of our web series, Composing for the Organ Composer Interview Project. Today, we are very happy to be able to speak with two collaborators, composer Nico Muhly and organist James McVinnie. Thank you both so much for being here.
Pleasure.
Our pleasure, my pleasure, everyone's pleasure.
Great. By way of introduction, I'd like to give a little bit of background information about both of these collaborators. Composer Nico Muhly's influences range from American minimalism to the Anglican choral tradition. The recipient of commissions from the Metropolitan Opera, Carnegie Hall, Los Angeles Philharmonic, Tallis Scholars, and St. John's College, Cambridge, and others, he has written more than 100 works for the concert stage, including the opera Marnie, which premiered at the English National Opera and was staged by the Metropolitan Opera in the fall of 2018. Organist James McVinnie's work as a performer encompasses music from the 16th century to the present day. He has collaborated with many leading figures in new music, including Philip Glass, Tom Jenkinson, Square Pusher, Angelique Kidjo, David Lang, and many others. He was assistant organist of Westminster Abbey between 2008 and 2011. Prior to this appointment, he held similar positions at the St. Paul's Cathedral, St. Albans Cathedral, and Clare College, Cambridge, where he studied music. So I'd like to begin this interview by asking you, Nico, what first led you to compose for the organ?
Okay, now I'm on mute. So, hello. I was a chorister as a boy in Providence, Rhode Island, and as my voice kind of approached changing, and I was a pretty good pianist, I started learning the organ at that time, and I would, accompany sort of maybe once or twice a month. And it was always in my brain because choral music is sort of at the heart of what it is that I make, no matter what it is that I'm actually making. But then it sort of came to pass that I've written a ton of organ music for Jamie, because we met, and it's like the organ, more so than most other instruments, you really are making it for somebody to make it for an instrument. There's a kind of serious intercessor, not to use too ecclesiastical a term, but you do need unless you yourself are playing it as for instance Messiaen would have done, like you're kind of at the mercy of an interpreter in a way that's so much more present than, for instance, like the oboe.
Great. So when you were prompted, if you were prompted by a commission, how did you feel about it? Were you excited? Were you anxious?
Which commission?
The very first one.
Jamie, what was that?
Well, I think you'd written Beamy music before, but I think
right.
It was the Hudson Preludes were the first.
Right. I mean, I think, honestly, for me, that writing for the organ is so part of my DNA. But with organ music, there's always a huge question that you have to ask yourself right away, right? Is it happening in a formal context, or is it happening in a concert? And I've found that you can go one way a lot easier than the other way. So concert music, for instance, doesn't necessarily, like, for instance, you wouldn't do like a movement from my organ concerto as a prelude in church, for instance, whereas a prelude in church could make its way into the concert stage. But that's the biggest question, is what is the function of this thing, right? So if it's happening on like the Feast of Christ the King as a prelude to evensong, that's useful to know. And if it's happening at someone's wedding, that's useful to know. If it's happening, so there are a lot of kind of situational things. So Jamie, I forgot what it was, but you basically you wanted a set of preludes that were different in character, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was I was on tour with Clare College Choir the summer of whenever it was, 2005, I think, which was about 9 months after we'd met, and we'd sort of been talking loosely about you writing for the organ, and there was this concert tour that Claire did, and we started in Texas and ended up we went up to Chicago, and then went over to Yale and New York, and
you stayed in my house.
Indeed, yeah, and we had about 30 concerts or something. It probably wasn't that many, but it seemed like that many, and an organ solo spot in this program. So there are two contrasting pieces. The first, which is a kind of sister piece to the Hudson Cycle for piano, and which is very slow and meditative, and then a fast kind of fun toccata thing to finish.
And so I think, again, I didn't find it daunting, but again, it is writing that. I also wanted to make sure it could be something that could be played in church, which it can. And it's, in a sense, it's a perfect prelude and postlude. And that's the way in which it actually gets performed the most.
Yeah. I remember when, after I'd graduated, I was at St. Paul's, and I told Nico to come on Ash Wednesday to church because he was in London. Didn't tell him what was about to happen, but I played the first prelude before the service.
So fabulous.
I think it was just kind of interesting for me as well, having played these pieces in the concert setting. I think this was the first time that I played them in a liturgical arena, and the pieces, they kind of take on a different life when they're devotional rather than just for purely concert appreciation.
And I think about this all the time with organ music and with choral music, and I think they're obviously related, which is that, in concert music, it's one thing. It's about, the composer, and it's about the composition, and it's about the soloist, and it's about kind of flashing, and it's about all this stuff happening. But then there's, in sacred music, your job is to kind of vanish, right? And there is, if you think about how much the organ, so let me think about it this way. If you think about a church service in the Anglican tradition, for instance, let's just say there's, X number of minutes of the sound of the organ being made, right? Not all of that is notated by any means. And a lot of it could be improvised, or a lot of it is reading, doing things to a hymn or doing things to a psalm chant or something that there's not necessarily they're two very different registers of music making that are happening, and that all organists who come through the church tradition know how to do, right? And there's a sense of improvisation, but there's a sense of reading the room, right? Like you have this instrument which can in fact take a piece of music that you would play one way in the evening and play a different way in the morning, or one way in Lent and one way in common time. So I think as a composer, understanding that the organ is this incredibly powerful machine, but with a human being who's has to be quite supple and sensitive, and ranging back to the age of Bach, like connected to the sense of like the spiritual as appropriate.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to hear you right off the bat talk about context and how that features into the way you're thinking about a piece. Certainly as a performer, we're always thinking about that. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the difference as a composer, Nico. I'm wondering, James, if you could talk to us a little bit about the initial collaborative project that you were discussing, and tell us maybe, how much contact did you have with one another as Nico was writing these pieces? Did he have 1,000 questions? How often did you play things for him? What was that initial collaborative experience like? And
well, I have to say with Nico, there's actually very little of that to and fro. We had actually with Register, the organ concerto, there was some things. I have smaller hands than Nico. And
as you can see through Zoom.
There are some, actually I'm learning a load of his piano music at the moment, which is really interesting to go back to music that was written at similar times to this early organ music. We went back and forth about some stretches that were basically, I sort of said whether something was impossible or possible for me. But essentially, Nico's so fluent with writing for the organ that really it felt like picking a score out of the music shop and just going home with it and learning it. And I think that's one of the great kind of privileges in a way with playing Nico's music, is that it's just fully formed, ready to go. And not to say that if you do have a collaborative back and forth, then the artistic process isn't as valid, but it's very much kind of fully formed stuff. And I mean, maybe you were going to ask me about kind of the specifics of writing the organ, but what's so special about Nico's scores is they have absolutely no indication for registration. So the collaboration.
There's some, right?
Yeah, there's some sort of adjectives and some descriptors, but in a way the collaboration kind of happens over the ether through that process. and bringing the music to life on the organ from a registrational scheme perspective is, I think, apart from the joy of playing the notes, is the joy of this kind of closeness that we have as two musicians.
And I think you'll find, I mean, over the course of your project, that I think there are composers who really want to be hyper specific, right? It's like, I want exactly this stop and I want exactly this thing. And the edge of my specificity, even though I mean, I know how to do it. If I wanted to be crazy about it, I could get this list of stops and figure, but I'm actually much more interested in, you know, again, like the human side of the organist, and allowing the organist, allowing the interpreter, in this case, Jamie, who knows me very well, like allowing that person into the process. And so, you know, the back and forth that you can have is, I mean, the one thing that's crazy about writing for the organ that this is like pure composer talk, Jamie, so hide your ears. Organists never hear it. They have no idea what the hell it sounds like. It's like, it's really funny because think about where you're sitting, right? It's the same way that conductors don't actually know what anything sounds like. Because it's like you've designed a space that's designed to sound awesome in the 6th row of the audience, right? And Jamie, you can probably speak better to this, but like different rooms have completely different,
yeah, right,
like where your body is at and when the sound gets to you and what it sounds like compared to like the congregation or the choir or whatever. And
yeah, I mean, I feel like the first time I really heard those pieces was when I got the first edits from, you know, John Rutter, who was producing for me for Cycles, the recording.
Right.
And I was like, oh God, actually that sounds, you know, I kind of, you know, as with so much organ playing, you're kind of, it's a bit like driving from the back seat of the car. You're kind of, you know, in terms of registration, but also in terms of the balance between various registers and departments of the organ. And of course, if you're playing for the choir, you're very much in the wrong seat in the room. So it's always a very slow process. And some of those pieces I've been playing for 5 years before, 6 years before that happened.
But yeah, I think composition, I mean, sometimes, for instance, I'm running a piece right now that's for choir and organ, and not for Jamie, it's for some random stranger. And, you know, in that case, I'm being a little bit more specific, where I'm saying, you know, I want 4 foot only, I want 8 foot and 2 foot, I want, you know, I want this to be just mixtures, or, you know, just mutations. I want this to be louder than this. I want this in the grade. I want this under expression. Like I can be that specific, and I think it's good to be that specific. And Jamie, the piece I wrote for Richard was much more, at least at the beginning.
Definitely. Going
through.
Yeah, that has much more indications on it. Yeah.
But it's also, you know, again, I think there are composers whose need for control extends to everything. But for me, I want to be surprised, and I think it's great. Like when there's one of the pieces I wrote for Jamie is this big cycle of Advent music based on the O antiphons, and it's a series of 7 little preludes. And that's probably one of the pieces of mine that's played the most, along with another piece I wrote for Jamie, which is a little prelude when a friend of ours was installed as a priest in his old parish. So those 2 pieces, I get recordings from all over the place, you know, people sending it to me, and it's so different and it's so great. Like, because it's like the organist's instinct kicks in, and at that moment, they're bringing to bear all of their history, and they're bringing to bear their knowledge of every weird church organ they've played, every concert organ, every harmonium in some church, you know. So it's like, and every organist has a different history in that regard. So when you leave a little bit up to, you know, when you let Jesus take the wheel, as we say, there's a kind of magic to it you know, you can get something unexpected, which as a composer, that's the treat, right? If I wanted exactly what I wanted, I would just write synthesizer music.
Yeah, and I think you're already sort of hitting on something that I think is really cool about the organ, which is just that there are all these really unique things that create challenges, but also are really gratifying. And just that openness and sort of reducing control is both of those things, I think, at least for me it was. And so I was wondering if you could talk more about other things that you find particularly gratifying about composing for organ, Nico, and also other things that you have found especially challenging.
Sure. Okay, so I mean, I can start with, interestingly, a lot of things are both. And I think that, for instance, the fact that every organ is really, really different it can be simultaneously amazing and also really frustrating, because you can think that you'll get a kind of elegant stop, you know, for like a long kind of melodic line, and it'll be beautiful, and you'll have heard it on a recording of like some Buxtehude that was done in that location, and you're like, okay, cool, let's use that. And then it sounds great. And then the next place you go, the equivalent version of that sounds like, you know, a serious like feline surgery or something. And, you know, and the thing is, you can email people and say, you know, send me your worst. Like, is there anything I should, you know, ignore? And Jamie, you know, well, it's like Cambridge, which is a city with, you know, 4 million organ, like you can't open a door without an organ popping out.
Yeah.
You know, there can be an organ like right here that has like the most fabulous trumpet in the world, and then an organist right on the other side of the wall that will have, again, something that sounds like, you know, Zelda from 1987. So that's frustrating, but it's also kind of fun, right? Because, you know, and then some organs, you know, the difference between the organ in LA and the difference in the organ in Philly when we did my concerto, there's just like, it's fun to watch an organist get excited about their own instrument or about a new instrument. So that's cool. That's a fun thing. A frustrating thing is that I'm pretty sure I could have better ideas if I had the run of an instrument, any instrument, because I can visualize pretty well the different ways, because you think about it like an orchestra, basically. So you think about making the registration as a weird kind of jacked up orchestra. But I know if I had an organ near me, I could come up with like slightly more innovative, you know, structures, and that is frustrating.
Do you mean like like Messiaen sometimes does with like things with registration that kind of sound at different octaves? Yeah, that's kind of, it's an interesting point.
Or just literally, like if I wanted to voice it, like pretend you have a chord that's like, you know, a C major chord, but instead of doing it like this, you do it kind of like this, and then you actually double, you know, this becomes 2 octaves up, and then it goes from being like a Mozart orchestration to a Stravinsky orchestration, right? Where Stravinsky's always like, let's have an oboe here, and then one like all the way uptown. So those are things that are frustrating, because there's no way to like read about it, and there's no way to really, you know, a nerdy example of something that I would use, but also would think less of other people for using, would be if you could buy a recording of Bach, let's say, and literally look at exactly what the organist did to make those recordings sound that way, like literally what list of stops, like, and then have an organist sit next to you and be like, you know, and you're like, okay, the reason that sounds like that is because is not obvious to you, but it's like because this combination of things, you know. So there's a lot of stuff that, you know, again, like with an orchestra, you can say, okay, the way that you know, Sibelius gets that extra special sound, it's like half the violas and muted, right? And then that's basically true no matter where you do that.
Yeah, right.
It is funny too. So with writing for the organ, because some organists I found really love their instruments, and some, as in their home base, and then some organists really dislike them, or really want to it's like they're constantly apologizing for things, which I thought was really funny. Like when I went to Australia, this instrument was well, remain nameless, but this instrument was so beautiful, and it had this like unbelievable sound for Baroque instruments, and they literally spent like 45 minutes apologizing that the French romantic possibilities were like less than ideal, and I was like, okay, cool, like whatever.
Yeah.
That's kind of a common outlook for organists. We're always wishing for something we don't have in the instrument we're at.
Right, but it's sort of like the fisherman's wife, right? Where it's like, oh, I want to be king, oh, I want to be pope, and then what's going to end up happening is that, you know, once the world burns, we're all going to be back on these little on these little chamber organs playing Gibbons, which is really what we should all be doing anyway, by the way. Like, and that's what I did in Jamie's concerto, where basically the whole thing is based on Gibbons, and at a certain point, all the shit gets washed away, all the orchestra goes away, everything goes away, and you're just left with literally like a four voice piece, just Gibbons for a couple bars. That's it, and then other stuff comes back. But it's meant to say like this instrument is, you know, it's an old instrument, but it of all the instruments in the world, I think it's probably metastasized in the most dramatic fashion. Wouldn't you agree, Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that, you know, music from the Tudor period and earlier you know, it's not about the stops, it's not about the pitches, it's about the counterpoint, it's about the interaction of lines. And actually, I find myself, when I'm registering new music and romantic music, often having to remind myself that actually it's not necessary to use a general piston for every single note in the piece. You know, this is just, you can just pull out one stop, or, you know, depending on how good the organ is, you can just pull out two stops and play the counterpoint. So I think, yeah, it's really important to remember that from early music. And I would say, you know, everyone's so fixated on, just to kind of big up Gibbons and Bird, but everyone's so fixated on the high German Baroque composers. The great sort of unsung heroes of the organ are, although it's not necessarily specifically organ music, are the keyboard music of William Byrd and Orlando Gibbons.
Yeah.
I think,
by the way, can I just say, in addition to like a picture of Jamie on the wall, like this just lives on my little harmonium, and I start every day with it. That's literally true. I just, you know, it's like, I really do wish that you could. I mean, I don't know how to convince composers to listen to early music. Yeah. I think it feels like a kind of, you know, historical Brussels sprout to them that they just like have to study for like 1 second and as an undergrad.
No, I mean, if I had to go to a desert island and I was just to take one like thing, I would take the Bird keyboard music, literally the two Musica Britannica volumes.
Yeah. It's just the best. I mean, it's. Yeah. But I think that is, if I'm addressing composers, is to think about the organ as, again, think about it like the orchestra, right? Where it started once upon a time when we were, you know, in kind of early polyphony, when we were, you know, fish or whatever in the you know, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, and then it just got bigger and bigger, but to still remember that there is like a human being and there's a heart to it that you have to always keep in mind. And I think, you know, that I always shiver when I hear a lot of music, contemporary organ music, that feels like it's just about weird and then loud, you know, which is like, I don't need to go to a concert for weird and loud because I have my own emotional landscape that does that, or, you know, or like 37th Street. So it's yeah, that would be my advice for composers.
It's easy to get carried away with all the things you can do on the organ. So I think a reminder that coming back to the basics, coming back to the polyphonic kind of root of the instrument is that's a really great thing to remember.
And I would just add that, you know, it's I did all of those antiphon pieces, and they're very colourful on that recording of Cycles, and then Fast Cycles happens immediately after that, and that is very, very severe, well, not severe, but it's just a very, very basic textbook organoplanum, you know, planum registration, which suits the music. But I kind of wanted to do a bit of a play on, you know, you've heard all of this crazy stuff, and here's just the organ in its basic bass kind of North German reality.
And even in the O antiphons thing, I at the end of it, I turned the pipe organ into like a farfisa, like a Philip Glass ensemble, like 1977, like just, you know, just absolute like T-Rex, you know, fifths. There's no motion, right? It's this completely austere, which again for me is another way to think about the organ, right? Because suddenly, right, suddenly these electronic organs were happening. And, you know, if you think about Philip's music, and he has a great body of organ music, some of which Jamie has premiered, but it's, if you think about just the beginning of, you know, music in 12 parts even is an example of just suddenly it's just these pure notes in counterpoint, and there's no other information. Or of course there's, you know, and there's of course the great Passacaglia of the trilogy operas, right, are based on organ C, right? That's like the point of those things. Anyway, whatever, sorry. Like, basically, you know, if I had my druthers, everyone would just listen to Einstein on the Beach and like Gibbons and Bird, and then listen to no other music ever.
Well, I was just to say that was great. Yeah, I guess going off of that, I mean, you mentioned sort of fifths, you mentioned a variety of other things, but are there like, and this you can feel free to get composer nerdy, are there specific compositional techniques or procedures that you think are especially well suited to the organ that you've enjoyed using in your pieces?
Well, let me think about it this way. I personally am interested in kind of modular pieces, so smaller, and let's discount the concerto in this, but smaller pieces which can stand alone, which can be shuffled around, which can find a home somewhere, because again, in church services, there are these weird interstitial moments where both on a local level, like in the 90 minutes of worship, and on a big level, like there's some random Sunday where we don't have quite the right prelude and we need to figure out something. And I'm interested in small form, and I'm interested in ways that you can relate instrumental music to choral music. So those are great things to think about, I think. But I think, you know, the organ is a really interesting compositional etude in a way when you think about it like an orchestra. And one of the things that I did, and now we're looking at concerto lens, is if you listen to Messiaen's organ music and Messiaen's orchestra music like in the same hour, so if you listen to any of the organ pieces and, you know, Chronochromie or From the Canyons to the Stars, like the weirder ones like Et Expecto, you know, that you start to realize that his theological interest and the like totality of his compositional brain, those two things require each other, right? And it's like you don't get the way in which those organ pieces kind of take weight and feel so thick is because, you know, he's using basically chords at a million notes that you would write for a brass, and that you see as these pillars in the orchestra music. Conversely, if you think about the fifth movement of Turangalila, which is like the gay Christmas one, that's essentially an organ toccata, right? It's like you get your hands in like Messiaen T-Rex position, right? Which is like one of these little gnarly things that you go, burp, 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 burp. It's so, you know, those things are related. So for me, again, talking to composers, it's like, think about it as something, think about it as this weird crucible of orchestration, orchestra information, in which like something goes in and something goes out transformed. And I think, you know, you can look at really any composer who's written fluently for the organ to kind of start that process. But the other like compositional technique stuff is to figure out how to make a hierarchy of your material that is obvious. And this is something that, and I think Jamie, you can probably speak to this, but it's like, I feel like it should be clear when you're looking at the music what information is foreground, what information is background, as clues or breadcrumbs to the interpreter, in terms of like, you know, because you can make something 60 times louder just by going like, So Jamie, I think, and I don't think we should talk about my music in this context, but I think with, for instance, you know, with Bach, or with even even like Vierne or whatever, there's always a clear hierarchy of information, right? Does that feel like an accurate observation? And it, you know, I think with composers, it's great to think about that as a, if you're thinking about keyboard music, sometimes things can feel kind of all over the place. And I think it's great to imagine that compositionally you're setting someone else up for success in creating the right balances.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that even I'm working on a piece for Dr. Laver, and there have been times where I'm just like, what if this became the foreground, or what if this, or what, you know, right. Like, or could we move it here, or could we do, yeah. And so I think that it's an instrument that can easily become soup if you're not really careful about it, but it also can become this very dynamic, magical stratification.
And speaking of soup, again, you know, this goes back to the very first thing. It's not just each instrument is different, but the room where it's at is different. You know, and there are places where, you know, how long is the reverb in St. Paul's? It's like 45 minutes, right, Jamie?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Like,
there are some acoustics where you're just never going to win, and St. Paul's is one of them.
But we did that fabulous concert in St. Paul's where
Yeah.
basically you like lean into it and you say, maybe I'll do this a little slower, maybe I'll register this a little bit differently, but you realize that it's sort of like committing to running in the rain. You're like, I'm gonna get wet anyway.
Yeah. You have to, it's not about playing slower necessarily. I mean, this is a kind of performing thing, but it's not about playing slower, but just playing with more breadth and more space in the music. I mean, I would just add that, I've had other people write music, or I've seen other organ music where it's a very compacted instrument on the page. The tessitura is much, much smaller than the piano, for instance, or the flute, or, it being an upper tessitura instrument. All Bach's organ music is very, very much sort of in the staves. There aren't many ledger lines. I'm not very good at reading ledger lines, as Nico knows. But I think that's one of the things. If you really don't know, if you're used to writing for the piano, pitch doesn't necessarily mean, like a note on a stave doesn't necessarily mean a pitch. And if you've got a mixture stop on the pedals, G and G are basically going to sound the same pitch.
Or you press a middle C and it's like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think Messiaen is always the composer that I say, if a composer's saying, oh, what can I listen to get a good feeling? I say Bach, Messiaen, because those are the two extremes. And I think if you have the kind of preludes and fugues of Bach, and then the chorale preludes with kind of weird mutation stops, that's just a really great way of introducing kind of where each note should go on the stave. I find that's often a difficulty with composers. It is, and that you do have to composer nerdy time. You have to treat the organ weirdly like a transposing instrument. So it's sort of like when you do those scores where you're writing bass clarinet in treble clef, but it's like down a ninth. Like you do, as Jamie said, that's actually a great piece of advice, is to think about it as like a 4-octave instrument, basically. Yeah. But it's like a small box filled with holes where light will shoot out and make it feel like it's a 12-octave. Because that's what's so bonkers about it, is that it actually goes lower than and higher than anything else. Yeah. Right. Because if you put on that 64-foot, whatever, like it's the biggest instrument, but it's a small control panel, right? It's like a 747. So imagining that there is this, not uncontrollable, but that you're working in a small space in order to project into a big space compositionally. And that's like, I still find myself, forgetting that an octave doesn't mean anything really. Yeah, right. And often I find that, not with your music, Nico, but often I find that I'll just play things down, things that are up there in the stratosphere, I'll just play down the octave. No one ever knows. Right. It's just, no one says, why is that not there? And it's funny. Another thing about writing for the organ for a composer, go sit next to an organist and have them play something for you, and then go into the room but just literally watch their bodies and see what it takes to change stuff around and to change textures and see how they're actually realizing, like what percentage of what's going on is learning the notes, and what percentage is making these like kind of meta, almost conductory decisions, or like orchestrator decisions, and how long it takes to execute that. So, just like it's, whatever those moves are, it's so different than watching someone play the piano or playing the violin. Because with those instruments, you're like, they got the right notes. And then the only other thing that you think about is like, did they wiggle around a lot or did they not wiggle around a lot? Right. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, and then if there's like sexist reviewers, it's like, was the dress too short? You know what I mean? It's like, no, but with the organ, there's so much other stuff that no one thinks about or talks about, that it, for a composer, it's like, it's really important that you understand what's actually going on.
I think also, organists are very rarely in view when they're performing. So there are concert hall settings where you can see the organist, you see their back, but you don't actually see what's going on with their hands unless there's a video screen. Yeah. So, you have to I like what you're saying about sit next to the organist and see what they have to do physically to make the piece work. But then, the product is going to be seeing are hearing that piece out in the room and
Yeah.
knowing that all that's happening kind of behind the scenes. Yeah, it's good.
You know, and Jamie, it's something that I never know how to deal with is, what about French romantic rep? Like, how do you? Because I feel like but no, because it's something that, like, I know we all kind of make fun, but you know, it's out there. You know what I mean? It's like we can't deny it. You know, I think about it usually as a kind of, not as a what not to do, but as a sort of, you could if you wanted to, in terms of how to use the instrument, and just in terms of composition. But I guess my question for you would be, if you were to tell composers, what are the lessons to be learned from Vidor? Like, what are the like compositional takeaways? Not necessarily about, like, you have to write a symphonic structure for organ, because, you know, whatever. Right. But I mean, like, composition on the technical front.
You mean playing wise? Playing
wise, but like, what is what makes that music so organy? And what?
I mean, that's you know, the idea that music is you know, I guess the most closely associated with replicating the power and the variety of the symphony orchestra. So from a playing perspective, you're having to deal with trying to make all of your crescendos as smooth as possible, and that is a skill in itself. I mean, yeah, that's basically.
So the entirety of French romantic organ rep, the moral is crescendi.
Yeah, crescendo and diminuendos. No, I mean, but I think that's a fair point, and I think. Yeah, I don't really have anything more to say about French.
Well, I think one thing I'm thinking of, Nico, in response to that question is that repertoire is so closely tied to the French symphonic organ in a big space.
Yeah.
So a lot of the textures that work really well, you know, those toccata textures where the top voice is Holt sustaining and the pedal is in canon, and all the stuff in between doesn't really matter. It's like, you know, it is the soup that you were talking about, but in a huge space with an organ voiced that way, it makes perfect sense.
Totally. So, and I think if that's the kind of music you want to write, then write it. And but just bear in mind that it's, you know, it won't work necessarily in other places. And likewise, I mean, you know, Nico's music could work in Saint-Sulpice, or Notre Dame, or you know, any of those French places, but it would be a very specific version of that. I mean, I've always, with new music, I'm interested in and have become more and more obsessed with creating music on the organ that you just wouldn't imagine being from an organ, or in other words, completely turning one's preconceived ideas, preconceptions about an organ on its head. So, you know, trying to make the organ not sound like an organ is basically my first and foremost goal when I'm dealing with new music. And it depends what it is, and if it is a kind of big soupy French style toccata, then there's not much you can do. But you know, if you take a lot of Nico's music, which occupies just a very different space, it can, I think one of the goals that every organist should have and every organ composer should have is to try to engage with new audiences and people who are interested in music and have a hugely imaginative musical mindset, and present the organ as an instrument that they wouldn't even have considered as being an ideal vehicle for new music.
That's a great point. Yeah,
it has always been at the forefront of musical innovation. I mean, it's, you know, if you look back through the ages, it's always been the most technologically advanced piece of musical machinery. And the music that Couperin wrote for the organ and Bach wrote for the organ, it was wild. I mean, the equivalent now is, you know, 102 Point Never writing synthesized music, you know. So it can occupy that space, and I've found that it's been very gratifying to reach out to new audiences like that.
Do you ever find, I find that one of the most moving pieces and titles is A Vision of Aeroplanes. You find? Because it's so great, because it's just as you said, it's like this is actually a piece of technology, right? And it was probably an organ in a town, like what would have been as complicated, like a bell tower? Like I'm
Well,
thinking,
so, yeah, I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, really the only thing that was as complicated as a piece of machinery was the clock.
yeah,
So there's basically nothing before 1840, 1850, and Henry Willis and Cavalier Cole were the first ones in the latter part of the 19th century to really kind of push things forward. But before that, they'd been in these incredibly complicated, complex pieces of machinery. There's a great chapter in a book called Beyond Bach, which describes rural life in rural Germany, and it's a wonderful depiction of, basically a very basic, plain way of life that was all about farming. And then they had this amazing Zilberman organ come into the church in Rotha, I think. Anyway, yeah, it's
anyway,
worth
read
looking
it.
up
Read it.
as a piece of cultural context.
I wonder if we might wrap up by if there's any other pieces of advice either of you might want to give to composers that are looking to write for the organ, or organists that want to get more involved with commissioning projects. Any other things that you haven't said already? You've given us lots of pieces of advice.
Mine is the easiest. Find an organist, find an organist, and really understand that it's gonna be, and it can be a more rewarding and more involved collaboration than it would be just on a technical level with any other instrument, because of all the things that we just said. That would be my advice.
Yeah.
Jamie, what's your
find a composer? Find a good composer.
Yeah, it's all about collaboration, really.
It is, but I would say, if you're an organist, listen to this. One of the most useful things that musicians can do for a composer is show us why something's good, show us why something's idiomatic, show us why something's bad, and show us why something is hard but worth it. Like unidiomatic but worth it, because
right.
You get this thing. And that's actually really, really useful information. And it's not information that we ourselves could ever divine from looking at the score. So that's really, really helpful. Like I'm writing for a saxophone quartet, God help me. And the first thing I did was I was like, well, there's so much music for saxophone. And I asked the quartet, I was like, send me the 4 most awful, like impossible to learn. Because I need to know, because what if I wrote that thing? So, and I was like, you can white out the names, like I know already. But it's like, and I think that would be really useful for composers. Like if an organist said, okay, you might not like this music, but this toccata is actually super satisfying for these reasons. Or like, I think this music is so good, but let me show you where I have to put my knee in order to in order to achieve like this this effect. And that's again, like, that's the kind of embrace you want to be in with your whatever.
I would the only thing I would add, and I'm just sort of assuming that this is aimed at undergrad, postgrad sort of ish, and I mean, this is a general point, not necessarily to do with working with composers, but I suppose it is. But and I'm sure this is at the heart of your teaching practice as well. But just listen to music that you wouldn't have thought you liked. The organ is such we're very quick to assume that the organ is a rarefied, potentially dying art. Therefore, we're terribly sort of eager to protect it and to be incredibly introspective in the way that we deal with the repertoire, which is of course wonderful. But seeing how Couperin relates to the harpsichord music, seeing how Bird relates to the vocal music, seeing how Nico's music, for instance, relates to Steve Reich's music and Philip Glass's music, push yourself out of your comfort zone, and you might come across someone whose music you like, and you can just be in touch with them. And also, don't be afraid to reach out to composers. Even if you haven't met them, just drop them an email saying, hey, have you ever written for the organ? Yep. Here's some really cool music. I love your music. Let's do something.
That's super good advice. And likewise. And I think, I think that's good advice for anyone. It's just, and it doesn't have to be like a thirsty email. but it can just be a kind of, you know, literally, I like what you do. And then things will, you know, yeah. And I would also say, if it doesn't go against any personal things, go to church, like find the highest, like gayest church wherever it is that you live, and go see like how the organ functions. And remember that thing we talked about where it's like the amount of notated music versus not notated music versus like a hymn, which then the organist literally paints the text per thing, or I mean, an Anglican psalm chant is, which is why you need to go higher and higher and higher. You know, basically you want to go to a church where you can smell the incense from around the block. And this, you know, if you think about a psalm chant, it's like the organist is literally making each verse, your ear is drawn towards the text. And that's such a magic trick that an organist in a liturgical context can do, in a way that, you know, if you, again, are in a church that does this before and after the gospel is read, let's say from the middle, you can really set up that specific text, right? Or it could be something even more fabulous, like whatever the Bach prelude was, right? Then the theme from that becomes a source for an improvisation as the book is being brought out, right? Or if you need to kill time, you know, when people are taking communion, if the Agnus Dei is really short or for whatever reason, then the theme from the Gloria of the Mass becomes a source for improvisation, and you can whip out some unexpected read, which is my drag name, for, you know, at that moment. And so just think about what the organist is really doing. It's like, you know, she's really molding the experience in a way that's much more than just, you know, this is incidental music. Or, you know, even if you yeah, I just think any kind of worship setting in which an organ plays a dramatic role is going to be helpful. And this is not just true in the Anglican tradition, but that's the tradition that I can speak to. But yeah.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Jamie. You have given us lots to mull over, and we are, if you want to, those are the people that are watching, I'm going to share my screen in a minute here and show you websites for these two. So if you want to go find out more and listen to recordings, look for other music that Nico has written, that James has played, this is where to go. And we hope that you will consider joining us on September 12th for our series of webinars. They're going to begin at noon Eastern and go till 5:30 p.m. And if you want to join us for that, please register using the link listed here. It is free and open to anyone. And you will find the schedule for the afternoon at that website. And we'll also be putting on a virtual concert that evening as a YouTube premiere at 7:30 p.m. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for all the pearls of wisdom. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.